In 2008, at that time the town's pastor, Daniel Price, was respected by all. With a warm smile and a steady voice, Daniel led the church with his wife Julia by his side. Julia was beloved in her own right, known for her kind heart and her work with local charities. They seemed like the perfect couple, deeply connected and rooted in faith. But beneath the surface, not everything was as it appeared. Julia's younger sister, Rebecca, had moved to Silver Creek Township, Michigan in early 2009. She had recently gone through a tough divorce and needed a place to start fresh. Daniel and Julia welcomed her with open arms, offering her a guest room in their home until she found her footing. Rebecca was lively, confident, and brought a spark to any room she entered. The community quickly grew fond of her, but no one more than Daniel. Initially, it started as simple talks. Rebecca would join Daniel at the church after hours to help with administrative work, organizing events, or simply talking about life. They laughed easily together, sharing stories and memories from years past. But as the months went by, their conversations grew more intimate, lasting longer than they should, filled with silent exchanges and lingering glances. By late 2010, the connection between them had deepened. Daniel found himself drawn to Rebecca in ways he couldn't explain, and she, lonely and flattered by the attention, didn't push him away. They justified their time together as support during her transition after the divorce, a way to help her heal. But deep down, they knew the truth. Julia noticed subtle changes. Daniel's eyes would light up when Rebecca walked into a room, and conversations at home felt more strained. He began coming home later than usual, offering vague excuses about church business. Julia's trust in her husband was strong, but doubt had started to creep in like a shadow she couldn't shake. Then came the night of February 15th, 2011. Julia woke up to find Daniel's side of the bed empty. She glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. Worry gnawed at her as she wrapped a robe around herself and stepped into the hallway. A faint light glowed from Daniel's study, and as she approached, she heard hushed voices. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the door. Daniel and Rebecca sat across from each other, their heads close, voices quiet and intense. The moment froze as Daniel turned, eyes wide with guilt. Julia's face fell as understanding washed over her, followed by a cold, sharp anger. Without a word, she stepped back and shut the door. The silence that followed was suffocating. The days after were filled with tension, Julia's smile at church becoming strained, Daniel's sermons losing their usual warmth. Rebecca moved out within a week, taking up an apartment across town, but the damage had already been done. Whispers began to circulate among the congregation, rumors and half-truths that stoked Julia's anger. Daniel tried to mend things, but Julia's trust had shattered. And Rebecca? She felt the sting of guilt and betrayal, but also a bitter sense of rejection as Daniel distanced himself, focusing on salvaging his marriage. She withdrew from the community, keeping her head down and her interactions brief. But secrets don't stay buried forever, and in Silver Creek, the air grew heavy with the weight of things unsaid. By August 2011, the once close sisters were no longer speaking. Daniel felt trapped between the life he had chosen and the life he now realized he had jeopardized. The perfect facade was cracking, and what lay underneath was darker than anyone could imagine. As autumn settled over Silver Creek in 2011, the tension in the Price household was palpable. Daniel continued to lead Sunday services with his practiced smile, but those close enough noticed the subtle shifts, a hesitation in his voice, a weariness in his eyes. Julia maintained her duties, greeting parishioners and organizing charity events, but the spark that had once defined her was fading. She no longer lingered after services, slipping out early with polite excuses. Rebecca kept to herself, avoiding community gatherings and limiting her interactions to casual nods and quick greetings. Her once vibrant personality seemed dulled, as if the weight of the past months had drained her energy. The people of Silver Creek noticed, but they chalked it up to the aftermath of her divorce and the stress of starting over. Only a handful suspected there was more to the story, and those whispers grew louder in private corners. It was on a chilly October morning that Julia found an anonymous letter slipped under her front door. The envelope was plain, with no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Heart pounding, she opened it and read the brief message. "Secrets have a way of surfacing. Be careful who you trust." The words sent a chill down her spine. She stood frozen for a moment, the morning sun streaming through the window and casting long shadows across the room. Fear and suspicion clashed within her, fueling her anger. Who could have sent it? And why now, months after Rebecca had moved out? Later that day, Julia confronted Daniel. He was in his office at the church, eyes focused on his sermon notes, when she walked in unannounced. He looked up, startled, as she slapped the letter onto the desk. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice low but edged with fury. Daniel's eyes darted to the paper, his face shifting from confusion to worry as he read. "I don't know who sent this," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But Julia saw through him. She recognized the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes refused to meet hers. "I'm tired of lies, Daniel. This town thinks we're perfect, but I know the truth. I want to know everything, and I want it now." Her voice cracked, revealing the exhaustion beneath her anger. Daniel took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. "It's over, Julia. Whatever happened with Rebecca, it ended months ago. I made a mistake and I'm sorry. But we need to move forward, not let this consume us." But moving forward was easier said than done. The letter was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more notes appeared, on their car windshield, tucked into Julia's handbag at the grocery store, even slipped under the church door. Each one carried a similar message, hinting that Silver Creek's beloved pastor was hiding more than just a lapse in judgment. The town's atmosphere shifted subtly. People who once greeted the Prices with warmth now exchanged curious, knowing glances. Whispers followed them at the diner, hushed conversations that stopped as soon as they walked in. Julia's unease grew, fueling sleepless nights and restless pacing. Daniel, too, felt the pressure, but maintained his composure, determined to keep their world from crumbling. Meanwhile, Rebecca was grappling with her own turmoil. She knew that the whispers and the looks from the townspeople weren't just because of her divorce anymore. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did something darker, a bitterness that had taken root since Daniel had pushed her away. He had made her feel special, chosen, only to cast her aside in favor of salvaging his reputation. It wasn't long before she started receiving notes, too. The first one appeared on her doorstep, taped to the frame with clear tape that glistened in the autumn sun. "You can't escape your sins." The message was as simple as it was menacing. Rebecca's heart raced as she scanned the quiet street, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. But there was only the gentle sway of tree branches and the distant hum of traffic. Rebecca knew she had to confront Daniel. She waited until a late evening service when the church was nearly empty and approached him as he tidied the altar. He looked up, surprised, as she stepped into the glow of the candlelight. "We need to talk," she whispered, eyes darting to the doors to make sure they were alone. Daniel's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Rebecca, this isn't the time or place." "Then when?" "People are watching us, Daniel. I'm getting letters too. This is bigger than us now." Her voice shook, and for the first time he saw the fear in her eyes. It matched his own. He sighed, looking down at the worn wood of the altar. "We stay quiet. We deny everything. We've already come too far to let this destroy us. But secrets have a way of seeping into every crack, widening them until everything breaks. and Silver Creek was about to learn that even the strongest facades couldn't withstand the weight of truth for long. By late October 2011, the tension in Silver Creek had reached a breaking point. The anonymous notes had become a daily reminder that the Price family's carefully maintained facade was crumbling. Julia's once gentle smile had hardened into a mask, and Daniel carried an air of restless worry that no amount of prayer could soothe. Even their home, which had once been a sanctuary filled with warmth, felt colder, as if the very walls were whispering secrets. The town's residents, once loyal and supportive, were growing suspicious. Rumors circulated faster than wildfire, first among the women at the hair salon, then at the local diner, and finally during hushed conversations outside the church. People pieced together fragments of overheard arguments, knowing glances, and whispered half-truths. What had begun as quiet speculation was now an unspoken certainty. Something dark was brewing in the Price family. Rebecca, who had kept her distance, found herself drawn back into the center of the storm. The threatening notes had stopped appearing for a brief period, but her sense of dread hadn't eased. She felt watched, haunted by an unseen presence that followed her home from the grocery store or lingered just out of sight when she took her evening walks. Every time she turned to check, there was nothing but the empty street and the rustle of leaves. On the evening of November 1st, Rebecca received a call that shattered the uneasy silence. It was Julia. Her voice was sharp, almost brittle. "We need to talk, now." Before Rebecca could respond, Julia hung up. The urgency in her voice sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. 20 minutes later, Rebecca stood at the doorstep of the Price home. The air was crisp, and the sky above was a deep, inky black. Julia opened the door before she could knock, eyes narrowed and filled with a mixture of exhaustion and rage. She stepped aside to let Rebecca in, and the tension between them felt like a tightly wound cord ready to snap. "I know you're involved," Julia said without preamble. Her voice was cold, each word delivered like a dagger. "These letters didn't come out of nowhere. Someone knows, and I need to know if it's you." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You think I'd do this? Why would I risk everything just to torment you? I'm getting the same notes, Julia." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and handed it over. It read, "Your lies will catch up to you." Julia's hand trembled as she read it, the color draining from her face. For a moment, the two women stood in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Julia looked up, her anger softening into something more fragile. "If it's not you, then who?" Before Rebecca could answer, the front door creaked open. Daniel stepped inside, surprised to see them both in the dimly lit room. His eyes darted between the two, and the tension in the room thickened. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice strained. Julia's gaze was sharp. "We're being watched, Daniel, and it's not just me. Rebecca's getting the notes too. Someone knows, and they're not going to stop until we're exposed." Daniel's face hardened, and for a moment he looked much older than his 42 years. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. "We need to handle this quietly. If people find out—" "If!" Julia interrupted, her voice rising. "People already suspect. I can see it in their eyes. We're not just at risk of losing our reputation, Daniel. This could ruin everything." Rebecca watched the exchange, a sense of helplessness washing over her. She had once trusted Daniel to lead with strength, but now all she saw was a man drowning in his own decisions. She took a deep breath and spoke up. "We need to find out who's behind this. If we don't, it's only going to get worse." The room fell silent as Daniel looked from Julia to Rebecca, realizing that this web of secrets had grown beyond his control. The consequences were no longer just whispers. They were a storm building on the horizon. The next day, the rumors took a more sinister turn. People claimed they'd seen shadowy figures lurking outside the church at night, while others said they'd heard whispers through the walls during service. Fear and paranoia gripped the town. No one knew who to trust, and even those who had once defended the Prices began to question their loyalty. On November 2nd, Julia received a final, chilling letter. Unlike the others, this one wasn't slipped under the door or left in her purse. It was pinned to the front of the church, written in bold red letters that looked like they had been smeared on hastily. It read, "The end of lies is near." Julia's hands shook as she read it, the early morning light casting long shadows over the stone steps. She knew the time for waiting was over. She had to confront whatever was coming, no matter the cost. Rebecca, who had been called to the church by a frantic Julia, stood by her side. "We need to tell the police," Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel appeared in the doorway, eyes dark and unreadable. "No police," he said firmly. "If we involve them, the truth will come out, and everything we've built will be destroyed." "But Daniel," Julia began, her voice breaking. "No," he repeated more forcefully this time. "We handle this ourselves." The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the quiet town of Silver Creek. But for Daniel, Julia, and Rebecca, the darkness had only just begun to settle in. The secrets they thought they could control were slipping through their fingers, and the consequences were closer than any of them realized. By the night of November 3rd, 2011, the tension that had gripped Silver Creek snapped like a taut wire. Julia sat alone in the dim living room, the faint glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. She clutched the last threatening letter in her hands, the bold red words seared into her mind. "The end of lies is near." Daniel paced the room, eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Rebecca stood in the corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes wide with fear. The silence in the house was shattered by the sudden ring of the doorbell. All three of them jumped, exchanging panicked glances. "Stay here," Daniel said, his voice low and tense. He moved to the door, hesitated for a moment, then opened it just enough to peer outside. Standing there was Mark Fletcher, one of the church's most dedicated deacons. He was breathing heavily, eyes wild, and his shirt was untucked, a rare sight for the usually composed man. "Mark, what are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his voice a mix of confusion and worry. Mark pushed his way inside, eyes darting to Julia and Rebecca. "You think no one noticed?" He spat, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You think you could keep something like this hidden forever?" Daniel's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, but his voice betrayed him. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Stop pretending. I've known for months. I saw the way you looked at her, Daniel. I saw the nights you spent in your office with Rebecca after everyone else had gone home, and then the notes. I thought they'd scare you enough to stop, to confess. But you didn't. You just kept lying." Julia's eyes widened in shock, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "It was you? You sent the notes?" Mark's gaze softened as he looked at Julia. "I was trying to save you, Julia. To save this community from the shame of what your husband has done, but you didn't see it. You just kept protecting him." Rebecca took a step forward, her voice trembling. "And what now, Mark? What are you planning to do?" A moment of silence stretched between them, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mark's eyes glistened with a mix of anger and despair. "I thought I could force you to tell the truth, but now I see you're too deep in this to save yourselves." Daniel moved closer, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mark, listen to me. We can fix this. We don't have to let this destroy everything we've built." But Mark's expression shifted, the controlled rage breaking apart. "No, Daniel, it's too late for that. Before anyone could react, Mark reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. Rebecca gasped, taking a step back as Julia's face turned ashen. Daniel stood frozen, eyes locked on the weapon pointed at him. The room seemed to shrink, the air sucked out by the weight of what was about to happen. "Put the gun down, Mark," Daniel said, his voice steady but strained. "This isn't the way." "It's the only way," Mark replied, voice cracking. His finger hovered over the trigger, but before he could make a move, a sudden sound interrupted them, a loud banging at the front door, followed by muffled shouts. "Police! Open up!" The tension shattered as chaos erupted. Mark's eyes darted toward the door, his grip on the gun faltering. In that split second, Daniel lunged forward, knocking the gun from Mark's hand. It clattered to the floor, and the two men struggled, their movements a blur of fists and desperation. Julia screamed, rushing forward to help, but Rebecca pulled her back, fear rooting them both to the spot. The front door burst open, and officers stormed in, their weapons drawn. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" The room fell into stunned silence as Mark let out a strangled sob, releasing his hold on Daniel and raising his hands in defeat. As the police secured Mark and led him away, Daniel sank to the floor, breathless and wide-eyed. The adrenaline left him shaking, the reality of what had just happened settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Julia and Rebecca stood in stunned silence, their faces pale, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. The following days were a blur. Mark's arrest and confession shook Silver Creek to its core. The details came out in pieces, how he'd discovered the affair, how he'd sent the notes to pressure them into revealing the truth, and how his desperation had led to that night's showdown. Daniel resigned as pastor, the scandal leaving an irreparable stain on his reputation. Julia left town, unable to bear the weight of betrayal and humiliation. Rebecca, too, disappeared from Silver Creek, seeking a new start, far from the place where everything had gone so horribly wrong. The town would never be the same. The whispers continued long after the Prices were gone, a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives could unravel in an instant. Silver Creek's lesson was clear. Secrets never stay hidden, and the truth, no matter how painful, always finds a way to come out.